webinar today, we're going to be talking with you about the provisions of the Equality Act 2010. We're especially going to be looking at how those provisions, particularly the religious exemptions in the Act, may be of help to you in your church. My name's Rachel Stone. I'm the HR and Safeguarding Team Leader at the Baptist Union, and with me today are two of my colleagues. Caroline Sanderson, our Legal Services Manager. Welcome to Caroline.
Thank you very much.
And Katherine Sinclair, Legal Director at Anthony Collins LLP. Welcome to you, Katherine.
Thanks, Rachel.
We've been working together for the last 18 months on a series of leaflets. All of these are designed especially for Baptist churches. So if you are a Baptist minister, a church leader, a trustee, then these have been specifically written with you in mind. We have three aims for the webinar today. Firstly, we want to introduce you to this topic and give you a good overview of the provisions of the Act. Secondly, we want to explain the legal and practical requirements for churches and give you a sort of route map for where you might go next in this process. And finally, we want to make sure that you know where you can get help and advice if you need it. I want to say at the beginning of this session that the law in this area is particularly complicated. So we have written a suite of guidance leaflets, each addressing a different aspect of the application of this Act, and particularly how it affects churches. All the detail on the law itself, on the practical implications, and how you might implement change are given in the guidance leaflets themselves. So we're not going to try and cover everything today. We're going to try and give you a good introduction to get you started. We have all seen the volume of inquiries on this area grow over recent years. And so our hope is that as we talk today and as we share this information with you, we're giving you information that's really timely and helpful for you and your church. Yep. So Caroline, can I come to you first?
Yes. What
is this new guidance and why do churches need to know about it?
This new guidance is called LO9. Actually, it's really L09, but colloquially we've been calling it LO9. And it's already a leaflet that's on our website. It's been on the website actually for over a decade because, as we know, we're talking about the Equality Act 2010. So this is not new law. But with all of the guideline leaflets that we have on the website, I'm really conscious that we want to make sure that they're always up to date and relevant for our churches. And so this was part of our ongoing review of our leaflets to make sure that it was up to date. We really want to make sure that all of the leaflets that we have are comprehensive and really legally robust for our churches to be able to rely on them when they're considering all sorts of experiences and situations that might crop up in their local church context. So we've actually been working with Anthony Collins solicitors for 18 months now on this new piece of work, on this new leaflet, this series of leaflets. What was one leaflet has become a number of leaflets, and I know you're going to touch on that later, Rachel. But it's been a substantial piece of work for all of us, and I know some churches have been waiting for this guidance, but I'm really glad that we can do this webinar today to introduce this new guidance to our churches.
So Katherine, what is the Equality Act of 2010 all about?
Well, Rachel, the Equality Act 2010 was introduced to protect people from discrimination in all walks of life. So, for example, when accessing employment or accessing goods and services, or if being a recipient of someone who's exercising a public function, for example. The Equality Act contains rights, powers and obligations in relation to 9 protected characteristics, which you can see on screen, of which religion and belief is one. And that's really what we're focusing on today. So the Equality Act makes it unlawful for an employer to discriminate, and by that I mean directly, indirectly discriminate, harass, victimise against an employee or a prospective employee as a job applicant because of their religion or belief, or more often than not in church's case, perhaps a lack of religion or belief. And of course it's the same for all the protected characteristics. So discrimination is unlawful. Some of these concepts, if they're new to you, are explained further in the guidance. And so we've got examples of direct and indirect discrimination. So if you're not entirely sure what I mean by now, then rest assured these will be explained to you with some practical examples about how that might look in your church context. Another example, the Equality Act also makes it unlawful for a service provider to directly or indirectly discriminate and victimise someone who uses or hires their facilities, for example. Now, it may come as a surprise to you that as a place of worship offering religious services to the general public, and that may also include your online provision, you are in fact a service provider. So again, it's wrong to discriminate because of a religion or belief or lack of religion or belief. Your church's foundation deeds will actually set out that your premises are to be used for Christian worship. Yeah. And interestingly, if your church runs a project out of it, so for example, a food bank or a nursery, for example, to members of the general public, or allows, sections of the general public to kind of enter their premises to partake in certain activities, then of course that's another example of being a service provider.
So you've talked about the 9 protected characteristics and that act is designed to avoid discrimination. So why are there religious exemptions in the Act, Katherine?
Well, prior to introducing the Equality Act 2010, the government did actually consult with faith-based organisations about where the proposed legislation might conflict with some of their beliefs, for example, and took that into consideration, which is why we have some legal exceptions that faith-based organisations are permitted to rely on, and provided they meet certain criteria, then that would allow them to lawfully discriminate in certain circumstances.
So let's come back and look at why would a church need to know about this?
So this new guidance is going to be relevant to all of our churches in the Baptist Union, not just the larger ones, but actually I really think it's important for all of our churches to engage with this. Already, our churches will probably already be relying on exemptions within the Act because they will be wanting to, for example, employ Christians in various positions within their staff teams. And so that's already an example of what would otherwise be discriminatory under the law if we didn't have these exemptions. So those churches will be discriminating on the basis of religion and belief. And as Katherine's already alluded to, we know that churches will have a variety of activities going on within their churches. And I always talk to a church about managing their risk profile. And so part of looking at this piece of legislation will be thinking about how churches use their facilities and their halls, for example, welcoming members of the community into their spaces for a parent and toddler group, or for example, using a space within their church for a food bank. All of those sorts of activities and areas of church life will need to be considered in the light of this guidance.
They're great examples, actually, because often they just get forgotten about, I think, in terms of the wider examples of what of church life.
Yeah. Our new guidance actually also addresses slightly broader issues that you might not have thought about in a church context before, such as membership, and also how you might be appointing leaders to your church, charity trustee, diaconate, as we would know it in our Baptist church context. So that is another aspect of church life where the Equality Act could have an implication for your church and the way it's run. So just to emphasise, any church, regardless of its size, can face a potential legal challenge. I get all sorts of calls from all sorts of churches across the union. And so this guidance will be relevant to all of our churches. And I really would encourage our churches to engage with it. And to clarify further, even if your church wants to adopt an inclusive position on some of these aspects, it will still be important for churches to have an ethos statement, which we're going to come on to shortly, and to consider all aspects of the guidance in these new leaflets.
Thank you, Caroline. So, Katherine, what do churches need to understand about the consequences of doing nothing, or where they might be facing legal risk?
Well, the Equality Act does permit organisations in certain circumstances to lawfully discriminate, provided it meets certain criteria. The law says that if your church, or perhaps a missional project that's run outside your church, wants to lawfully discriminate, then it's going to need to be able to justify the use of any particular exception that it chooses to rely on. And this, of course, is going to involve making sure that your church has thought through the rationale for using that exception and has discerned where it stands on certain issues and has put together some documentation to evidence and back up its position as to why it's using the exception. If your church doesn't take the time to think through these issues and to put supporting documents in place, it's not a case of just going, well, today is Tuesday, I'm going to use that exception. It needs to be thought through and planned in order to use it, in order to best withstand challenge. Because the worst case scenario is that you are faced with a discrimination claim by a prospective employee because they didn't get the job. And they say, well, actually, you discriminated against me because I'm not a person of faith and I could have done that job standing on my head and I was the best person for the job. Well, if you haven't thought about putting that occupational requirement in place correctly or justified the use and sort of looked at the criteria for when it might be applied, then you could be facing a discrimination claim. Similarly, if you refuse to hire out your premises to someone who wants to hire your church hall, for example, and they want to use it for purposes that are perhaps are not quite in line with the existence of why you as a church have been set up and what your purpose is, then you're at risk of a potential discrimination claim there, unless you can justify your reasons for refusing it.
And we see that actually
absolutely,
with churches quite regularly.
But let's face it, no one wants to be caught on the back hoof. So if you've kind of taken the steps to think through these things, it will help you be more prepared when these situations arise and save yourself a load of embarrassment and a potential discrimination claim. Now, I've mentioned discrimination claims several times, but the reason why they're important is that liability is unlimited. So in an employment tribunal claim, if you're faced with a claim for discrimination, there's no cap on potential an injury to feelings award, for example. Similarly, if a service user or potential service user brought a claim in the civil courts, again, as far as I'm aware, there's no cap there either.
Right.
If your church doesn't take the time to think through its decisions, its choice of legal exception to rely on and put the paperwork in place to back up its decision and support the action that it's taken, then worst case scenario, it may not be able to successfully defend a claim for discrimination or justify the use of the exception. And that could mean that your church is facing an award for injury to feelings that's with uncapped liability. And that's quite a scary prospect. So the reason why we basically have drafted this suite of guidance to empower your church and put them in the best possible position to withstand challenge. And the other thing I'd mention is that, often we make decisions about things, don't we? And then time passes, people's memories fade. Sometimes in employment, relationships turn sour, people leave, and then you're faced with a challenge. But if you haven't sort of done that thinking through at the beginning and put your paperwork in place, it can be a real challenge to go back retrospectively and think, oh yes, why did we apply this? And cobble that evidence together.
Really helpful.
And we've seen churches come to us who are already facing tribunal challenge. And whilst they've had good intentions, they haven't been through a process, so it becomes more difficult to defend, I guess.
Absolutely.
And it's not enough for a church to say, we're a church, therefore our position is assumed to be X, Y, and Z.
Increasingly not.
So Rachel, we've heard a bit about these new leaflets, the suite of leaflets, LO9. Can you give us a little bit more detail about what's in each of those leaflets?
Yes, there are 5 of them in the new series. The first 2 are about recruitment. So the first one is about, can we justify employing a Christian? That's a question that both you and I get asked a lot already by churches. So the second leaflet is also about recruitment, but it's looking at the organised religion exemption specifically. So the third leaflet is about the importance of being able to define your Christian ethos as a church. And included in that, there's a template of an ethos statement that you can use as a guide to what you might want to include. We want to be really clear in there that while we've included some example statements, it's for you and your church to decide what fits for you.
Absolutely.
LO9D is all about goods and services. So Katherine was talking earlier about the service provider provisions, and that's what LO9D focuses on. And then finally, LO9E is all about how this bit of law affects things like church membership and church leadership. The good news for churches is that all of these leaflets are available completely free of charge on the Baptist Together website. If you've not used that before, go onto it, go to the resources section, and you'll find that there are leaflets on, it seems like every subject under the sun. But you can search for LO9 and you'll find this suite of leaflets there. You can read them all from beginning to end, or you might decide that you just want to read about recruitment, or you just like to think about goods and services to start with, and either way is fine.
Great.
It's also worth mentioning that this video of our conversation today is also available online. So if you wanted to watch it with other church leaders or your trustees or with other church members, you can easily get at it and then maybe have a discussion together afterwards.
Yeah.
There are 5 leaflets in the series, but also inside the leaflets you'll find links to other useful pieces of information in documents. Yeah. So for example, our new Safer Recruitment Guide is in there. Clearly that's relevant to leaflets A and B in the series. You'll also find things like our updated hiring agreement template for churches. So there's lots of other good pieces of information that you can access through the relevant LO9 leaflet.
Great.
We mentioned that leaflet LO9C is about an ethos statement. Katherine, what is an ethos statement and why would a church want to spend the time putting one together?
Okay, so an ethos statement is what makes you distinctively Christian. So it's the essence of who you are, what your mission is, what sets you apart from other churches, what's unique to you as an organisation, and often forms the basis from then, the mission activity that you undertake and your wider picture. So it's a really key document. Most churches will probably have a vision and values document somewhere on your website, and that's often a great place to start. And in the absence of that, well, you may have a statement of faith, or look at your constitutional documents. That's they're going to be key as well, regardless of whether you've got a vision and values statement or not. And then the Baptist Declaration of Principle is also a great starting point if you haven't got one in place.
Well, that's really helpful to understand. So why would a church want to have one?
If your church is going to use some of the exceptions that are permitted under the Equality Act, then it's going to need to be able to document its Christian ethos in clear and unambiguous language.
Okay.
Your church's ability to rely successfully on one of the religion and beliefs exception is also going to depend in part on its ability to demonstrate in your organisation's documentation the clarity of your Christian purpose and the expression of your ethos. And that's why it's so important.
Yeah.
For example, I probably best demonstrate this by a couple of practical examples. So if your church has discerned that it believes in the sanctity of marriage, for example, being solely between a man and a woman, and has discerned that consequently there needs to be a requirement for its minister or for a particular post to be held by someone who was going to be committed to being celibate outside marriage, for example. It will only be able to do that if it can demonstrate that applying this requirement is a proportionate way of complying with the church's doctrine, or a proportionate way of avoiding conflict with the deeply held religious beliefs of a significant number of Christian followers within the church. And the issue is, though, is that how is it going to be able to demonstrate their compliance or the non-conflict principles in the event of a challenge if you don't have some sort of agreed statement or principle of belief or ethos to evidence what your view is on those issues? Another example, you may work through our guidance leaflet A, for example, and come to the conclusion that actually you're not able to apply an occupational requirement for the role to be carried out by a Christian, but perhaps you could require from them a commitment to be sympathetic to your church's Christian ethos, and not to do anything to undermine that Christian ethos. But again, how are you going to be able to ask that of the employee if you haven't got a document setting out exactly what you believe and what your Christian ethos is? So that's why it's really important. The challenge for churches within the Baptist Union is that each church is autonomous and each church must come to their own discerned view on a lot of these issues. Why is this? Well, the Declaration of Principle holds in union Baptist churches with widely different theological understanding, and which is amazing. But as a result, it says very little on a lot of these issues, and as a result of this discernment process, each church may come to very different positions from another church within the Baptist Union. But that's why it's really important that a process is gone through, and it's probably worth saying that not all members may agree on some of these issues, and so of course that discernment process, which you're going to talk about, needs to be handled sensitively.
Yes.
Katherine, it's really helpful to understand that. We know that a lot of our churches are really pushed for resources at the moment.
Absolutely.
Why would they take time to prioritise this and to do the work around an ethos statement?
Because if it wants to lawfully use some of the religious and belief exceptions that are available to churches and faith-based organisations, doing this and starting with the Christian ethos, the statement of faith, your values and vision document, it will put your organisation or your church in the best possible place to withstand challenge.
Yeah, I like to talk to churches about future-proofing
Yes.
as well, and making sure that they can do something now that will benefit future generations as well. You know, if you've got some really good charity trustees in place now who are willing to really look at this and engage with it, how much that will benefit future trustees coming in after you as well.
Definitely.
And churches contracting us are always very keen to do the right thing.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes it's quite hard to get to grips with that.
Yes.
I mean, that's why we spent all this time. 18 months is a long time
Yeah.
to work on this new set of leaflets. But we just want it to be accessible to churches so they can do what they want to do, which is get it right.
Yes. So Rachel, there's a lot for a church to consider here. What are the practical steps a church can take? Where should they start with all of this?
Well, I think the good news is that many churches probably already have documents that are helpful in this process. Yeah. So, for example, your church constitution document may contain some clear statements about your church and its theological basis. You might have spent time working on a values and vision document together, which again just sets out what you agree together. Why is our church here? How do we serve our community? And then there are other more specific documents, things like job descriptions, person specifications, recruitment materials, how you describe yourself to potential staff. All of those would be relevant. And you might want to go back and have a look at your hiring agreement as well. If you haven't got a hiring agreement, don't panic, because there's a template one in the new set of leaflets.
And not all churches will have buildings to hire out,
That's true, of course, yes. So you don't need a hiring agreement if you don't hire out any rooms. That's a really good point. But if you do, and you think, oh, it's a long time since we've looked at that, or actually we don't have anything that's substantial, this is a great chance to go back and say, okay, we can do some work on that as well. So if we look at it from a very practical perspective, you're probably going to want to set up a small working group in your church. For everybody to look at this at the same time would just be too much. Yeah. So there's a great opportunity to pick a small group of people who are representative of different parts of your church family and ask them if they'll do some work together, starting with all those documents and materials and statements you might already have, and then moving on through the process of working through LO9C and looking at a church ethos statement. Now, as part of that work of the working group, they may well want to prioritise what they look at first. So if you are about to start recruitment for a new staff post, then you might really want to go to A and B and be clear on what you're doing. Yeah. Make sure that your paperwork, your application form, your advert is in the right shape and suits the role you're recruiting for. On the other hand, you might say, actually, we don't have any vacancies at the moment. We'll get round to that, but we do rent out our rooms really regularly to all sorts of groups in the community. Yeah. So we'd like to have a look at that first. So getting your priorities together, thinking about where the risks are, is a really good starting place.
That's really helpful, yeah.
In many churches, it's likely that this is the very first time you've talked about these sort of issues together. You might be a bit anxious about how those conversations are going to go. The key thing is that you do have the conversations and you do communicate really clearly. Why might we do this? Why does that help us as a church? And how might that affect the way we do things? And everybody's views are welcome in that, even if you can't reach an easy agreement between you. Caroline, we've just talked about communication. How do we engage with our church members meeting about this?
Well, we've already heard from Katherine that having an ethos statement is a really significant part of this process, and it will be really important to consider that in the context of the wider church members meeting. So it goes without saying that congregational governance is a key Baptist principle, and so it's really important that our church members are able to come together to prayerfully discern where they stand on some of these theological positions. And it's really important that they are able to meet together under the lordship of Christ and be guided by the Spirit to come to a clearly discerned position on these issues. Being able to demonstrate that your church has met with the members and has reached a clearly discerned position will, as Katherine has referred to, help the church be able to fend off any risk of legal challenge.
I guess it's providing evidence for the discussions and the decisions that you've reached.
Yeah, and we don't underestimate that this could be quite a challenging process for our churches to engage with, and it's not necessarily going to happen very quickly either. I mean, that process of discerning with the church members' meetings could take perhaps many months. It might be that with your leadership team or your working group, as you suggested earlier, Rachel, you have a series of meetings where over time church members are encouraged to engage with these issues and consider prayerfully what their position might be on these issues. And it's not going to be necessarily an easy path for all churches. So some churches might want to consider this in a creative way. They might want to consider, for example, running a survey, some kind of survey monkey, or engaging with their church members, some of whom might not often come to church meetings, but it's a question of looking at the way to do this process in a way that makes sense for your church, and look at some of the other significant decisions that your church has already taken in recent years, where you've had to have those meetings to make decisions about other life activities in the church and significant decisions in the life of the church. So you're not suddenly coming at this from cold. Of course, regional teams will be able to support churches here too. They're very used to going along to helping churches with all sorts of pastoral situations, but also going along to church members' meetings as well. So I'm sure they'll be able to offer additional support there too. So as Katherine's already mentioned, it's going to be really important for churches to have this clearly discerned ethos statement so that they can rely on either that compliance principle or the non-conflict principle. And depending on how your church takes these significant decisions and operates its own form of Baptist congregational governance, we will be expecting there to be some form of church members' meeting decision to ratify decisions or to reach that clearly discerned position that will be evidenced in your ethos statement. So clearly some of these decisions are not going to be easy for churches, and we just would encourage churches at this point to set along that path, make a step in the right direction towards tackling these issues, and so start out by looking at the documentation, as you've said, and getting to a point where you can have that church members meeting decision at the end of the road. So obviously it's just about managing legal risk and avoiding challenge, and I don't think it's acceptable for any church just to be able to take it for granted that just because you are a church, that therefore you will already have a position that everyone will understand. If your church members want to adopt an inclusive position, then they may be at less risk of challenge, but I still think it's really important that a church has a clearly discerned position and that it's written down and evidenced clearly so that you can rely on those legal exceptions should you need to.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's being back to clarity again, isn't it, which we've mentioned earlier on, being able to show clearly where you as a church stand.
Yeah. So Rachel, once a church has already discerned its position and got its ethos statement, what are the next or final steps towards implementation?
Well, there's work to do at this stage, and clearly lots of good work's already gone on in getting that to a church meeting and getting to a decision. It's likely that your church will need to do some work around its recruitment materials. as a good starting point, around its hiring agreement, around things like its recruitment practice. So, for example, are your interviewers trained? Do they understand how to interview well, and how these exemptions might apply in your church? Really important they get the detail of that.
Yeah.
Now, if you do hire out rooms and buildings, that's wonderful, but you need to go back to your hiring agreement to make sure that it's fit for purpose. As we say, there's a template version available as part of this suite of leaflets. So you might want to start by going back and having a look at who uses the building at the moment and what do they use it for. Do you even know what they're doing when they're in your building? It's a good starting point, isn't it? Then you might need to say, okay, in the light of that, are we going to have to speak to any of our current hirers about whether or not we're able to continue with them in the rooms? How might we have that conversation and how might we put a new hiring agreement in place in a way that everybody who uses the halls or rooms understands it. And thinking about membership and leadership particularly, you might as a leadership team want to go back and look at how you go about explaining church membership to people who are interested in joining. You might want to look at the information you share when someone is being interviewed to be a member, or a pack you give them as they start. And you might also want to go back and say, is there any difference between our expectations of members and our expectations of leadership? All these things take time to do, of course, but it's worth the time and it's worth the conversation, even if you start in quite different places. Really useful to be able to get back to that place of clarity. We know what we believe, we know what we stand for, we know what our ethos is, so that as we are dealing with our community, dealing with each other, we've got real clarity. And that clearly helps you stay on the right side of the law as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So earlier, Katherine, you took us through the legal exceptions and exemptions that are available to churches. We're just going to take a moment to watch that back now.
So my job is now to talk you through the legal exceptions that are available to churches in the field of religion and belief. But before I start, I just want to say that there's no need to take detailed notes, because everything is set out in the guidance leaflets with practical examples and more advice about when you can and can't use these exceptions for you to revisit and read through in detail at a later date. The starting point is that it's unlawful to discriminate against an employee or a job applicant because they're not a Christian or are without faith, unless you can demonstrate your Christian ethos and you have an occupational requirement that the employee be a Christian. There are 3 occupational requirements relevant to religion or belief in the sphere of employment and work, which an employer might rely on when trying to defend discrimination claims. Concerning recruitment, access to promotion, transfer or training, and also in dismissal, except in relation to sex. Now, the first occupational requirement is one that you may be familiar with, called the general occupational requirement. And this is available where considering the nature or context of the work being of a particular religion or belief, so in this case being a Christian, is a requirement for the work. The second one is called the organised religion exception, and this permits discrimination in respect of sex, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and marriage or civil partnership. There are certain circumstances where an employer can apply a requirement that an employee is of a particular sex, or that the employee is not a transgender person, or that the employee is not married or a civil partner, or perhaps relating to circumstances in which the marriage or civil partnership came to an end, or related to sexual orientation. However, I need to emphasise that those requirements can only be applied in a narrow set of circumstances. And these are if and when the employment is for the purposes of an organised religion. So that might include applying such a requirement to your minister as an office holder, and it might also be applied to a small number of lay posts such as youth workers. It needs to be necessary to apply this occupational requirement. Why? Because it's either one of 2 things. It's a proportionate way of complying with the doctrines of the religion. This is what we call the compliance principle, or it's a proportionate way of avoiding conflict with a significant number of the religion's followers' strongly held religious beliefs. And this is known as the non-conflict principle, and we'll be referring to both of those later on in the session. So you need to be satisfied that the individual to whom you are applying this organised religion exception does not meet the requirement that you have made. For example, your church might discern that it needs to apply an occupational requirement that its minister not be transgender or not be divorced, or a requirement that its youth worker be celibate if gay. If the exemption doesn't apply, then discrimination on the grounds of sex or sexual orientation is unlawful, and it's not always clear. So if in doubt, it's always a good idea to seek specific advice when seeking to use this exception if you're unsure. The third occupational requirement is for employers with a religious ethos. And there's a lot of crossover between this and the general occupational requirement. So an employer with an ethos based on religion or belief in certain circumstances show that being of a particular religion or belief is an occupational requirement. So for your church to apply this requirement successfully, being a Christian must be a requirement for that work. And a Christian project run out of your church, for example, would need to be able to evidence that it has an ethos based on religion or belief by referring to appropriate documents, such as its or your church's founding constitution. So it's worth noting that these occupational requirements, while they can lawfully permit you to discriminate in certain areas of employment, which I've mentioned, they won't enable you to defend discrimination claims relating to the terms on which you offer the employment, or the way in which you conduct that employment, or by any way of any other detriment. You can only use these occupational requirements to lawfully discriminate in the fields of recruitment, access to promotion or training, and then also relating to dismissal. So now I'm going to turn to the provision of goods, facilities and services, and speak a little bit about the general religious and belief exception. So in that area, it's unlawful for a service provider or anyone exercising a public function to discriminate against a member of the general public because they're not a Christian or because of any other protected characteristic, unless your church can rely on something called the general religion or belief exception. Churches are service providers in that they offer access to membership, worship services, and may hire out their facilities, run playgroups, cafes, food banks, and other activities. So the question is what can you restrict under this exemption? So under the general religion or belief exception, it's possible to restrict participation in activities. It's possible to restrict who you might hire out your facilities to or offer services to on the grounds of either religion or belief or sexual orientation. So when does that general religion or belief exception apply? Well, it only applies when the sole or main purpose of the organisation is not commercial. So the organisation must have one of the following 5 purposes. The first one is practice a religion or belief. Well, a church does that. Second one is to advance a religion or belief. Well, a church also does that. The third one is to teach the practice or principle of a religion or belief. And yes, a church does that. And the fourth one is to allow people of a religion or belief to participate in any activity or receive any benefit within that framework of that religion or belief. And the final one is where the purpose of the organisation is to foster or maintain good relations between people of different religions or belief. So as you can see, all of these 5 purposes would potentially apply to a Baptist church. So that's the first threshold passed. Then there are further conditions, and the religion or belief exception would only apply if it was imposed, number 1, because of the purpose of your church, which you can evidence, or 2, to avoid causing offence to others of the same Christian faith. So, for example, when hiring out your church facilities, it's a good idea to think about in advance when you might need to rely on the exception before it happens, and obtain information about the purposes for which the premises will be used before accepting any booking to avoid any unlawful discrimination in the hiring arrangements, potential embarrassment and/or potential breach of contract if your church then decides to cancel the booking. Now, the next thing is, well, when does the sexual orientation exception apply? So, as with the religious and belief exception, non-commercial religious organisations that have one of the 5 purposes I have just mentioned can impose restrictions on their provision of goods or services or facilities which would otherwise be unlawful discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. But your church must be able to demonstrate that the restriction is to comply with the doctrines of the religion. It's that return to the compliance principle I spoke about earlier. Or the restriction is to avoid conflict with the strongly held belief of a significant number of followers. Back to that non-conflict principle again. It's key to note that the general religion or belief exception is not applicable to organisations which do anything on behalf of a public authority or under the terms of a contract with a public body or receives public funding. For example, if your church ran a food bank for the community for which it receives grant funding from the National Lottery, it wouldn't be able to rely on that exception. Or if it ran a single dads group on behalf of the local authority, then the exception relating to sexual orientation would not be available. Under the Equality Act, this exception doesn't permit service providers, so churches, to discriminate on the grounds of gender reassignment. And it's worth noting the inconsistency between the exceptions. So in employment, the organised religion exception permits lawful discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment in a very narrow set of circumstances, whereas the equivalent exemption in the provision of goods and services does not. If your church is going to place restrictions on who can take part in certain activities or when hiring out your premises, your church can only do this if it can demonstrate that the restriction aligns with your church's beliefs and ethos.
Wow, thanks Katherine. That's quite a lot of legal content for our churches to grapple with. We recognise that it's really important, but also that might blow a few minds in grappling with it.
For those of you that are panicking that you didn't take enough detailed notes, we're happy to say that all of that and more is in sort of bite-sized format in the leaflets.
Yeah, great.
So Caroline, where can churches go to get more information or legal guidance?
Yes, Rachel. Well, we've produced these new leaflets called LO9, and that is going to be the first port of call for churches when they're wanting to find out more about this subject, because we've got a range of helpful practical examples and that legal guidance that we've been working on with Anthony Collins. So that's going to be the point of triage, let's say legal triage for churches to find answers. Of course, if there are any questions that arise from any of the leaflets, then anyone in a church can contact either yourself or myself. So we've set up a designated email address, which is just l09@baptist.org.uk. And that means that we'll be able to pick up those emails that are going to have specific questions that will have arisen from this advice. And so I hope that will be really helpful for churches. Of course, we are going to encourage our regional teams to support our churches as well, as they do on a whole range of issues. And to be clear, we will be inviting the regional teams to be offering pastoral support for churches, perhaps helping with those church members' meetings that we've talked about, and not to be offering legal advice. That's in the leaflets, or that will be specialist advice that churches will need to take.
Thanks, Caroline. So, Katherine, how would you and your colleagues at Anthony Collins support a church who found that they were struggling with this?
Well, we can help in a number of ways. So as we know, the Equality Act is a complex piece of legislation, and it may be possible that the time will arise when you might have questions specific to your circumstances about how you should apply the Equality Act, or you're not too sure about how to apply any of the legal exceptions that I talked about earlier today. or you want a second opinion on some of the documentation, the contractual documentation that we've drafted. So where you've got questions that go beyond the legal guidance that we've drafted, then that's where Anthony Collins would be able to step in and help. And if you're not sure about something, it's always best to get specific legal advice that's tailored to your circumstances.
Yeah.
Again, if your church suddenly finds that it's facing a challenge from either a job applicant or an employee about your recruitment processes or your application of any of those occupational requirements I talked about earlier. So, the tricky organised religion exception, for example, then if it's facing a challenge, that's where we can step in and help you navigate the process. Similarly, if you get a challenge for over the use of your premises that you're hiring out, and there's a question about your policy on that, and you need to take legal advice, or you need some assistance in terms of coming up with a defence or just navigating through the scenario, we can help you do that.
Good stuff.
We've come to the end of this session, and I hope it's been a helpful introduction for you. And my thanks go to Caroline and to Katherine for their wisdom today and for their work on this new set of guidance leaflets. All of the guidance leaflets are available on the Baptist Together website, and all of them are free of charge. You are welcome to contact us if you have any more questions, or if you get questions from members and leaders in your church. This is a complicated area of the law, and many churches have already been contacting us about the issues we've been discussing today. Finally, we really want to stress that we are not trying to tell churches what they should do, and certainly not what positions they should hold. But we do want churches to have the tools and the understanding to be able to look at this together. As Caroline said right at the beginning of our conversation today, we want people to be able to understand potential risks, understand what this law means in a church setting, and we want to make sure that we can effectively manage some of the legal risk that comes out in these situations. Thank you for taking time to watch this introductory video today. We hope that this information and all the content in the guidance leaflets is of real help to you, to your leaders, and to your church. We want to make sure that as you think about risk and you think about law in this area, your church can make good decisions about how to use some of the exemptions if need be, or simply to agree on your position in relation to these areas. Most of all, we hope that what we've done today has given you good information so that you can carefully and prayerfully talk about this in your church.